Joining me now is Danya Perry, former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and Molly Jong-Fast, Special Correspondent for Vanity Fair. Good evening to both of you. Molly, I'd love to start with you. What surprised you the most about the 1-6 Committee's final report?
Just how much evidence there was. I mean, there's just a sea of evidence. You know, they tried this so many times in so many different ways. And Trump, you know, there's so much proof that Trump knew, that Trump told people he knew, that there are all these witnesses, I mean, from Cassidy Hutchinson down, who said, you know, they knew what was going on. I mean, her story with Giuliani, where Giuliani said tomorrow's going to be great. I mean, there's just so much premeditation and so much, you know, just mountains and mountains of evidence. More than, 200 times they tried in different ways to overturn the election results.
Danya, same question to you.
Yeah, I think the same thing. It really is this vast body of information that they've gathered and the way they marshaled it together to present such a compelling narrative. I think those of us who have been following the hearings very closely weren't surprised there weren't, many new details in there necessarily, but it really is the presentation and the narrative that is so gripping and so compelling, and that I think really will be compelling to Special Counsel Jack Smith and the Department of Justice ultimately.
You know, Danya, you wrote in a New York Times op-ed, quote, by focusing on a short list of potential defendants and charges and substantiating them, the committee has provided the public, the press, and above all, federal prosecutors with a powerful aid. You and I are both former prosecutors, Danya, so I know you can also appreciate the significance of the DOJ being provided with an evidentiary roadmap for the prosecution of some very serious federal offenses. So what are the immediate next steps for the DOJ?
Yeah, this really is exactly as you said, a roadmap. It's a prosecution memo. It's a white paper. It's, an exhaustive recitation of the evidence and the way that it was collected and the different ways that the committee was able to get at this evidence and test the evidence. So it really is kind of a dream for prosecutors. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, we used to, sometimes we would get a great piece of investigative reporting and we would use that as a go-by. This obviously is, an 845-page report, as you said, that really, ticks through each of the elements of each of the crimes which the committee for which the committee is referring Trump and others for prosecution. So I think we know from the surge of activity that we've seen out of the Department of Justice and recently with the appointment of the special counsel that there's a lot going on, that there are grand juries that are impaneled, that there are witnesses that have been subpoenaed and that are testifying, that there are search warrants, that there are phones being seized. So we know there's a flurry of activity, and I suspect that special counsel Jack Smith will read this very carefully along with all of his line prosecutors and use it to see this, and of course the body of evidence to which we've been talking about, just use that to know who to talk to, who would have evidence that is helpful, what information maybe isn't helpful, that's really just as useful to a prosecutor. And so just use that as a go-by to methodically look at all the evidence and decide for itself which, if any, of these potential violations that they are going to pursue.
Molly, this report dropped late Thursday night. It's more than 800 pages. The timing of the release has been criticized, but do you think the American public can fully appreciate its breadth and substance without actually having to comb through 845 pages?
Well, I think we have to be careful when we think about what the American public, what their response is, because you'll remember that when the January 6th hearings started, there were a lot of pundits who said this is not going to move the needle. People aren't going to care. Maybe they tuned in, but they're going to forget about it. And even as late as October, we heard pundits saying that, voters don't care about democracy. Voters don't care about January 6th. And then we saw in the midterms that actually voters care a lot about democracy, and that there were enough people to make a critical mass, to really hand the midterms largely, even though Democrats lost the House, it was a very good midterm for them, historically good. So I do think that it's hard to tell right now. Look, these are pages and pages of testimony. It's not for everyone to read, but the reality is it's out there now and it can be used in all these prosecutions. And remember, Trump is going to be a defendant for the rest of his life. He has, the DOJ case, and then he's got Georgia and New York, and just endless cases.
Danya, Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, Trump should plead insanity if he gets prosecuted. Tribe later saying it was tongue-in-cheek, but do you agree that Trump's legal defenses to the criminal charges that were the basis of the DOJ referrals just really might be that thin?
Yeah, I do agree. I think it sounds like Professor Tribe was being a little arch in his tweet, but there's a little something there if we look at the caliber of the defense that Trump himself, forget his legal team, has been putting out. He said in his post, his truth, whatever it's called, that there was no insurrection. Just as one random example, obviously that's not going to fly. That he knew nothing, and that the committee has put forth not a shred of evidence that he knew anything. They put out 845 pages. They have 1,000 plus witnesses. They have countless documents. So yes, I agree. Better than putting forth the kinds of defenses that we've seen. He's got to come up with something else, and he has very few options.
Molly, over 1,200 witnesses, 845 pages. I can tell you I had some disappointment with the 1-6 committee. No mention of Ginny Thomas. What's your take on the absence of people like Ginny Thomas that we've heard so much about, that we know that actually were interviewed by the committee members? What's your take on the absence of people like that from that big tome that was released as the final report by the 1-6 committee?
Well, it's impossible to know what why they left out what they left out. But I think we have to trust that what they put in there was enough, and it made a good enough case so that they felt that prosecutors could follow that case. Certainly there's a lot of subjecture. There's a lot of, wonder about Ginny Thomas and various other players in the January 6th insurrection. But I think ultimately what really matters is, that they get the solid case. And what they said at the end, in that last hearing was that there's one person to blame for this, right? That there's one person who was the guy at the top, and that's Donald Trump. And if they make the case against Trump, ultimately, I think that was the first responsibility of theirs.
Danya, I got less than a minute, but I have to ask, part of the 1-6 committee's mission was to make recommendations for legislative reform, including reforms to the Electoral Count Act, barring Trump from holding federal office, again, via the 14th Amendment, et cetera. Do you think that's going to be enough to protect democracy in America the next go-around?
I can only hope so. The committee made a point of saying that unless there's accountability, this can all happen again. So unless there's some type of reform, unless there's some form of accountability, it is anyone's guess. And all we can do then, if none of those things happen, is, cross our fingers and shut our eyes and hope for the best. So I sure as heck hope so.
Danya Perry, former federal prosecutor, thank you so much for joining us. Molly Jong-Fast, my friend, please stick around. We've got a lot.